Is the afternoon yet?
It's just got
Almost. So close. Good morning, everybody. It's 11:58 right now, just barely morning. And today what we're going to be doing is one of our prehistoric painting streams here. It's been a minute since I've done one of these. I used to do one every month when we would, we're doing the streams a little more often, but it's been a busy, handful of months here at HSC, and so I haven't had the time to sit down and do a extended stream like this, but we got a nice slow day today. The weather's a little too nice for people to be visiting, I suppose. And so we're going to be doing one again. And we have, of course, a prehistoric painting coming up this coming Sunday. Prehistoric painting is an event we host every month, so it's always the third Sunday of the month in the afternoon. I think it is 3 to 5. Don't quote me on that, but I got to double check on that, what time it is. But you can book ahead of time and book a slot. I think there's usually 20 slots available, and it's first come, first serve as far as booking. And basically what you do is you get a little 3D printed animal, and the animal changes every month. And so this one, we have 2 different molds of the same critter. So these are called Chalicotheres. And this is going to be an interesting one, because honestly, this is one I don't know a whole lot about. I know there's sort of a Ice Age adjacent thing. I know they're related to like horses and rhinos and things like that. And I know they're quite big, but I honestly don't know a whole lot about them. So part of what we sort of are always doing with these is we see what YouTube's got for us as far as doing some educational content, and as they often do, PBS Digital Studios has us covered on our weird niche prehistoric critters. So I think I'm going to get this video started, and then we're going to start doing our painting here. You can see actually I brought with me last month's animal we did was called a Chalicotheres, which is a, theropod dinosaur, relative of things like T-Rexes and stuff like that, but just a little lesser well-known. Well, that's part of what we like to do here, is we like to highlight some of maybe the lesser-known prehistoric critters, maybe something you haven't heard about, so that when we're talking about it, you actually hopefully learn something. And Carl, who runs these painting nights, loves his prehistoric critters. He's a fountain of knowledge, so if you do come in, make sure you ask him all sorts of questions, because he loves that. And so, I think with no further ado, I'm going to get this video started. I might have to do some adjusting on the volume of it. I didn't really do much of a sound check before we started here. We are open today. The Headwater Science Center, of course, is open 9:30 to 5 every day except Sunday. We're open 1 to 5. And so could be that some folks wander in or around, or you might hear some noise coming in off the exhibit floor, but we're kind of tucked into a little corner up here, so maybe we'll be relatively isolated. But I think we'll get started.
Thanks to CuriosityStream for supporting PBS Digital Studios. This creature is an extinct relative of horses and rhinos known as Chalicothere. And this creature is also a Chalicothere, even though they look pretty different. Both of these animals lived at the same time and in the same places, and they did the same things. They're both closely related to each other and to horses and rhinos, and they both developed highly specialized adaptations that help them exploit their main source of food.
So, right away, one thing I'm noticing here is that this one's talking about a divergence of 2, he's saying Chalicotheres. I've always heard it pronounced, I guess, Chalicotheres, but I don't know, your mileage may vary there. One of the things you'll notice is that we actually have 2 different molds here, and they do look pretty different. And so yours, like I said, the one thing I was noticing right away is your forelimbs on yours are a lot longer. You have a big humped back on yours. Yours is also doing what's called knuckle walking, where rather than having its feet flat on the ground, it kind of walks sort of like a gorilla, where it's got, looks like it has pads on its fingers that it uses for support, maybe. So maybe that's what we're going to learn a little bit about, is why our 2 models that were printed off are so different, which was one of the questions I had coming into this, actually. So good on you, Hank Green, for helping us out. But I think I'm going to get started.
The leaves at the top of trees. The first animal is known as Chalicotherium,
just
and it
alcohol on
wound
the
up
bottom of
having
these, so you
enormous
might want to rinse them
arms
off a
and
little bit
walking
before you
around
actually
on
start
its
painting. But yeah,
knuckles,
otherwise,
kinda like a
go nuts.
gorilla. The other is called Tylocephalonyx, and it turned out to look a little more horse-like, but with a longer neck and this weird bony dome on its skull. So what happened? How did 2 of the same kind of animal living in the same place end up looking so different? The answer is parallel evolution.
I think.
You can't really talk about the history of life without talking about natural selection, the process by which living things can become more likely to survive and have offspring that will also survive if they become better adapted to their environments. And Chalicotheres are an especially great example of how this process actually works. Because in evolutionary terms,
Selection
better
pros
can mean a
here.
lot
How
of
much
different
paint
things.
is left in them may
Success can
vary
take
a little
many
bit.
forms,
I
even
tend to
for
have some
organisms
pretty
that live in the same
loud
environment
designs
and
on
face
mine
the
because
same
I tend to
challenges.
use the paints
Before
that
they
don't get
diverged
used
into
by other
different
people when
types,
they're doing these.
Chalicotheres first showed
So I
up
get a
in
lot of
Asia
very
around
bright
55
colors in
million
mine
years
a lot
ago
of the
during
time.
the Eocene epoch
But
of the
you can do whatever
Paleogene
you like.
period. They soon made it to North America and Europe and eventually to Africa. During the Eocene, rainforests were widespread and they became home
The
to
browns
a group
and
of
tans
herbivores,
and stuff
hoofed
tend to go pretty
animals
low.
called Perissodactyls, which today include horses, rhinos, and tapirs. Perissodactyl means odd toed, and like many other members of this group, early Chalicotheres had hooves, even though their hooves were split into two, which was kind of strange. But as the Eocene ended, Chalicotheres' hooves had been replaced with something new: claws. Now, claws on plant eaters are rare. So rare, in fact, that the paleontologists who first found the feet of Chalicotheres thought they must have come from anteaters or maybe giant pangolins. But we know now that Chalicotheres were herbivores because their teeth bear the distinct scratches and pits that come from eating leaves, bark, and twigs. So instead of using their claws for digging, these animals...
Yeah, it's interesting to say that claws are rare on herbivores. I guess that's never an association I've really made. Because, you know, it's one of the things we talk about when we're doing our animal demo is like when people see or hear about claws, their first association a lot of times they make is like using them as a defense mechanism or a thing to like catch prey. But like he sort of was hinting at there, a lot of the animals that have claws aren't using them for that. They're using them for like digging or climbing is usually the primary function of a claw. I don't know, that rings as a little strange to me that like they would see claws and be like, oh, it's probably not an herbivore, because like, I mean, like squirrels have claws, like rabbits have claws. there's lots of herbivores out there with claws.
Not sharp claws like a cat, though.
Yeah, it's true, but I said it's a little bit of a different. Squirrels have pretty sharp little claws, actually. Rabbits not so much because they use theirs more for digging, but your animals that are using them for climbing, like those claws got to be pretty sharp. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's true on an animal that's the size of a rhinoceros, like having claws. They're probably not using it for climbing. So yeah, having sharp claws, if they're sharp, is probably a little different type of niche. Or maybe they are in trees too, who knows? Maybe we'll learn something wild today. These things could climb very well.
Probably used them to get at the tastier leaves that were higher up in the trees, a type of eating preference called high browsing. The claws may also have helped Chalicotheres stand on their hind legs and brace themselves against tree trunks, making it easier to browse. And they even had specialized neck vertebrae that allowed them to look up more easily than like a horse or rhino. So by about 40 million years ago, Chalicotheres had arrived at a single, pretty successful body plan, optimized for high browsing. But then things started to get weird. Soon after the ancestral Chalicotheres developed claws, they began to follow different evolutionary paths. They started to evolve in parallel. One group of early Chalicotheres got very good at pulling leaves down to eat, so over time those animals with longer limbs were more successful, until about 30 million years ago they all ended up with big hulking arms, long claws on their front legs, and necks much shorter than their ancestors. And because of this new body plan, these animals started walking with their front toes curled inward to protect those claws. They began walking on their knuckles. These animals became known as their own subfamily of Chalicotheres called Chalicotheridae. But meanwhile, a separate group of ancestral Chalicotheres started to develop its own adaptations for high browsing. Its early members were much better at nibbling leaves right off the trees without having to pull them down. Over time, those that were taller and had longer necks were better at getting food, until eventually they looked more and more like long-necked horses, or maybe short-necked giraffes. And they still had claws too, but all their legs were about the same size, and these animals were bigger and heavier than their long-armed cousins. So knuckle walking was not an option for them. Instead, they acquired the ability to retract their claws. They had specialized tendons that helped them pull their claws up while they walked.
So yeah, retractable claws is an interesting adaptation. That's like when you're first learning like sort of naturalisty type of stuff, and you're learning like identifying like animal tracks if you ever are in 4-H and doing that type of thing. One of the first things that you always learn is to look for whether or not there's claws in the footprint or not, because particularly things that are closely related to cats typically have retractable claws, and so there won't be claws on the footprint for, as in cat-related things, but dogs do not. And so, like I said, when we're talking claws sort of in this sense, where we're seeing it as like a footprint claw, it's almost always associated with carnivora. And then, like I said, it's a great identifier for if it's part of the sort of cat-like carnivores or the dog-like carnivores, is whether or not you can see the claws in the footprint or not. So yeah, dogs cannot retract their claws almost across the board, and cats can almost across the board. One exception for the cats not being able to retract their claws, I think, is cheetahs, if I remember right.
Cheetahs can retract their claws, just not quite all the way.
Or is it like maybe their back feet can't or something like that? There's some goofy thing with them where they... So yeah, the retractable claws thing is always an interesting, like I say, great like intro to like impress your friends of like walking out there and it's an experience that like you probably have just like being in rural northern Minnesota. You're out on that dirt road, you find some tracks, and somebody's like, "Ooh, is it a bobcat or something?" And it's like, "Nope, that's a domestic dog." It's got claws out.
The tendons were further strengthened by a fusion of several bones in their toes. And in many members of this group, domes also appeared on their heads. No one's exactly sure what purpose they served, but the prevailing theories are that the animals used them for headbutting and a display to potential mates, as you do. And this group of long-necked, dome-headed Chalicotheres came to be known by the ungainly name of Chalicotheres. But just like the other subfamily, they were still Chalicotheres. So if these two groups of animals lived in the same area, why did they split at all? Why didn't they just keep evolving as one group, ending up either as long-armed knuckle walkers or long-necked, horse-like dome-head things? Well, that's what makes parallel evolution so interesting. It often occurs among closely related animals, even ones that share the same range. And in this case, it happened because both body plans were equally likely to help an animal survive. So early on, among the original ancestral Chalicotheres, some variations appeared, which happens all the time in groups of organisms. Some Chalicotheres had longer necks and others had longer forearms, but both differences helped ancestral Chalicotheres survive, reproduce, and ensure that their long-necked or long-armed traits were passed on to the next generation. Slowly, over time, Chalicotheres drifted apart until the differences were so extreme that they were different species, and then different subfamilies. But they both remained really good at doing one thing: eating the tops of trees. Of course, as you know from the lack of them, their success didn't last forever. Despite their specializations, Chalicotheres aren't with us today. The last of both families died out in North America 10 million years ago, and they lingered in Asia and Africa until around 1 million years ago. One possible clue to their demise is the rise of the artiodactyls, herbivores with 4-chambered digestive systems like deer, cattle, and hippos. This digestive setup is much more efficient than the single-chamber system that Chalicotheres had. So Chalicotheres would have had to eat a lot more food to get the same nutrition that a giraffe, for example, could get with less food. And changes in climate wouldn't have helped. As Africa and large parts of Asia became drier, grasslands started to spread, reducing the habitat of the tree-living Chalicotheres. Today, horses and rhinos remain their closest living relatives. So you can take the story of the Chalicotheres as proof.
Then he talks about like success here, and one of the things that we talk about a lot with these prehistoric painting things is thinking about animals as being successful or not is always an interesting discussion, because there's a tendency to think of animals that like go extinct as being sort of like failed species sort of in a lot of ways. But honestly, like when we're talking about it, like he just said that they, I don't know, did he say when they started existing? He said that they went extinct in North America about 10 million years ago, and then in Asia about 1 million years ago. But at the very least, you're still talking about like a group of animals that existed for, a 8-digit number of years and was able to like survive that long, which like, you can again think about this in the context of like humans. Like the anatomically modern human has only existed for somewhere between like 200 and 300,000 years at this point. And so, as I said, it's always one of those things of scale where nothing lasts forever. No species lasts forever. Things change over time. Things change at different rates, but things are always changing. And just because like an animal goes extinct doesn't mean it wasn't like successful for doing what it's doing. I say a lot of times when this stuff goes extinct, it's because of stuff changing around it that makes, you know, the thing that made it successful in its time not viable anymore. And so climate change ends up being like the primary motivator for species going extinct kind of throughout history. Something changes in the environment and all of a sudden animals that are adapted for the prior environment can't exist anymore. And it's an interesting thing you can kind of track is that between mass extinction events, you can really see like broad diversification of species where like what kind of sort of is continually happening is you get like species that are diversifying out, you get more and more and more species that exist, and all of a sudden you get this, as species like diversify to fill like very specific niches, and then something about the environment changes, and then you get a mass extinction that happens where all of these like hyper-specialized animals that were built to be really, really successful in this prior environment suddenly can't survive in the current environment. And so you see a big reduction in the diversity of species happen where you get these big mass extinctions. And then, again, you see like a really fast diversification afterwards generally because all of a sudden you have a bunch of generalists that make it through that then diversify to fill these specific niches that now exist that didn't exist before. And so it's kind of a fun thing where like when you're looking at like the fossil animals that exist at a time, there's sort of this weird like almost like curve that happens where you're seeing like a bunch of really weird stuff that exists like right after a mass extinction and right before a mass extinction because like I said there's a ton of time for right after a mass extinction there's like not competition in a lot of niches, so kind of just anything works out, so animals are trying all sorts of weird stuff just to like get whatever they can get out there. And then like I say you see sort of a filtering effect that happens where as the competition in these niches increases, stuff that's less viable sort of falls off. And then you get more and more and more specialized over time to the point where you start seeing really weird stuff because it's hyper-specialized for like this one very specific thing. And then, like I said, you get a mass extinction, everything goes back to being generalists and then gets weird again until it all goes extinct again. And you can, like I said, you can track that for pretty much every mass extinction that's happened in world history. It's a fun thing to look at, sort of trends over time, and like I said, it doesn't necessarily mean that an animal was not successful or a group of animals like, you know, was poorly designed or whatever. Like they're subject to the same forces that any other group of animals are, and instead, like you sort of hinted at there, the diversification happens because they reproductively what happens is the animals that are the most successful are most likely to reproduce, so the animals are always getting sort of more and more successful, and then like I said it's either some other group of animals coming in and out competing is a reason that a lot of stuff goes extinct. We talked about this a couple years ago probably at this point when we were talking about all the big like solo hunting dogs that used to exist in the Americas kind of just get wiped out as soon as cats come to the continent because the cats just outcompete them in the same niche. Or like he was talking about here where, you know, you have groups of ungulates that have these multi-chambered stomachs so they can compete for the same food and not have to eat as much of it, basically, so they end up out-competing in the niche. Lots of reasons a thing could go extinct that are, you know, ultimately, like, not just like, oh, this thing was, like, destined for failure from the start.
Of how versatile natural selection can be, how it can lead to many different evolutionary solutions to a problem, all of which are equally successful. But you can also read this story as a lesson in its limitations. I mean, if anything, Chalicotheres turned out to be too specialized. Each group became too good at highbrowsing to the point that when the climate changed and competition pressure was on them, they couldn't survive. There are some situations that evolution just can't get you out of. Thanks to CuriosityStream for supporting PBS Digital Studios. With CuriosityStream, you can stream documentary films and programs about science, nature, and history, including exclusive originals. For example, you can check out Planet Dinosaur, a 3-part BBC series about the latest discoveries from the days of the non-avian dinos. CuriosityStream offers unlimited
But I've had some issues with some of the plastics that we use for these printings where some of the paint just doesn't do it for it. Some of the lighter paints in particular, lighter
like
colors
art.
seem
You
like
can
they
let us know in the comments.
don't stick
And
super
don't
well
forget
to
to go
some
to
of them.
youtube.com/eons and subscribe. And then go talk to all your friends.
I've
Tell
made a
them to do
very
it too.
spectacularly ugly color for my... I mixed some pink and some yellow and some black and got... So not the most pleasant color for my like base that I'm gonna make. Alright, what else we got? What else we got for Chalicotheres videos? Let's see what Dr. Polaris has to say about it. It's always the fun part about these two is, who knows? I don't go invent these videos first. I'm just open to whatever.
Hello, everyone.
Oh boy.
Clawed calicotheres are one of the most bizarre groups of derived ungulates to ever live,
See, he says calico.
falling behind only cetaceans in terms of their divergent nature. Members of this lineage developed into browsing herbivores with a range of anatomical
Grab
traits
some
that
paper
converged on
towels
those
quick.
of carcatures, giant pandas, ground sloths, and gorillas. Where modern ungulate mammals walk on digitigrade hooves and manipulate food with their mouths, calicotheres adapted to a more sedentary mode of feeding, with some species spending a great deal of time sitting on their haunches. In aid of this, ancestral blunt hooves developed into grasping claws for seizing foliage, while they had longer forelimbs and shorter weight-bearing hind limbs. Lower in sizes that cropped food against a toothless pad in the upper jaw, and low-crowned molar teeth. First originating in the tropical forests of early Eocene Asia, roughly 48 million years ago, basal calicotheroids would not have seemed too different from their close perissodactyl cousins. The oldest and most basal known calicotheroids were the Eomoropids, which were native to what is now China, Mongolia, and Pakistan between 48 and 33 million years ago. Information concerning these animals is quite scarce, and I wasn't able to find any decent images of them, only photos of their teeth and jaws. Despite this, we know.
Yeah, it's one of the things that you don't always necessarily associate with doing paleontology, but like a lot of the times the information you're working off is so crazy minimal. That's part of what we like to talk about during these like painting nights, is that part of the fun of it is that we're probably very wrong with how these animals like actually look. So we're, doing a fun painting thing, and you'll look it up 20 years from now and compare it to the one you made, and it's gonna potentially end up looking very different. That's just like part of the history of paleontology, is trying to speculate on how these animals looked and being very wrong about it, which I think is always very fun. But yeah, part of the challenge is a lot of these species we only know from a few very small remains, where, like I said, with these calicotheres, it's like teeth and stuff seemingly is what a lot of them have that are associated with them. Because the last video mentioned like doing some particular analysis of the teeth as well to sort of determine their herbivore nature. But yeah, it's a persistent issue, is like finding teeth from a thing and saying, okay, this seemingly is the same like type of jaw and teeth as this other thing that we know existed in this like around the same time period and is very reminiscent of the teeth from this thing, and building a creature based on that. And that's how you end up with some of these very like terribly wrong animal designs that end up happening. Is, like I said, you're stuck with pretty minimal information or trying to speculate from there.
But these were relatively small, low-browsing herbivores, about the size of sheep. Their molars were low-crowned and fairly generalized, suggesting that they fed on leaves and soft vegetation. The genus Littolophus, at least, appears to have had four-toed feet typical of early perissodactyls, with each digit ending in a hoof-like uncle, suggesting that claws emerged later in the more derived Chalicotheres. Eomauropidae contains only 4 genera, and probably doesn't constitute a genuine family, more likely being a grade of basal Chalicotheroids. These animals became extinct at the end of the Eocene, most likely as a result of the cooling and drying climatic trends at the time. However, their more derived sister group, the Chalicotheriids, persisted into the Oligocene and had diverged into 2 major subfamilies by the end of the period. The first of these were the Chalicotheriids, which developed a suite of highly specialized traits suited for a sedentary browsing niche. These included very long forelimbs, short hind limbs, and a relatively gorilla-like physique, including knuckle walking on their flexible forelimbs, which bore long, curved claws. Members of this subfamily possess some of the longest forelimbs and shortest hind limbs in relation to each other out of all extinct animals.
Yeah, it's something that I guess we didn't really touch on much, is that the relative limb length on especially the one that you're painting there is very strange. Like, it's not a thing you really see much, wherein most quadrupedal animals, the limbs are pretty close to the same length, and in humans, or stuff that oftentimes goes on its rear limbs more often is the rear limbs end up being a little bit longer. Think about a kangaroo or something like that, or a human, where the rear limbs are longer. But there are a handful of species that have longer forelimbs than rear limbs, but a lot of them tend to be primates. That's why I assume he titled this video, he called them the gorilla horses or something he called them, because gorillas are one of those things that have longer forelimbs than rear limbs. And so that's atypical, because a lot of the times, if you're doing that type of locomotion, it's being heavy in the front is weird as far as the way you're moving around, because it means that if you're trying to go up onto your rear limbs, you're very top heavy, it's hard for you to balance. If you ever watch chimps or gorillas or gibbons trying to walk on just their 2 back limbs, they're very awkward. They can do it, but it's a very awkward thing for them. And it sounds like the expectation for these guys is that the ones that have the long forelimbs are doing it specifically so they can go back on their rear limbs to get up on these high trees. But I said it's probably not something where you'll see a chimp walking on its rear limbs because it's carrying a thing in its front limbs. I would expect that that's probably not so much the case for these guys, where I think probably it looks like all the time that they're spending on their rear limbs is probably with aid of a tree to help keep them up, probably, because they're, you said, doing this high browsing where they're need to stand up to get to food that's unavailable to. There's a lot of big mammals that exist at this time, so being able to get up high in that way probably has its value.
Chalicotheres probably evolved in Asia and appear to have been inhabitants of heavily forested environments, similar to modern giant pandas and gorillas. Tooth wear patterns indicate these animals fed on leaves, fruit, and soft vegetation pulled down from the canopy. One of the oldest known members of the group was the genus Chalicotherium, which was native to Eurasia from the Middle Miocene to the early Pliocene, between 16 and 3.6 million years ago, standing up to 2.6 meters or 8.5 feet tall and weighing up to 3,300 pounds. This slow-moving browser inhabited the closed forests of Miocene Germany, China, and the Indian subcontinent. With a superficially horse-like head, flexible upper lip, and lacking canines as adults, Chalicotheria would have utilized its large claws both as hooks for seizing vegetation and for defense against saber-toothed cats and anthysionids. Callosities on the ischium imply that these animals would sit on their haunches for extended periods of time.
Is one of the bones in the pelvis, and so what he's saying there is that they probably take their food, bring it down from the top, and then sit on their rump while they're actually eating it from wear pattern stuff. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do just looking at wear patterns. You can tell so much about an animal's lifestyle just by seeing like where ligaments are worn out, where there's smooth part on a bone, whatever type of stuff. They do it a ton with teeth, but you can do it with all sorts of different stuff.
Built in what is now Bulgaria and possess thickened dome-like skulls, superficially similar to those of pachycephalosaurs, which are probably used in mating displays or in territorial confrontations. It is also worth pointing out that most Chalicotheres were quite brachycephalic, with shorter muzzles and rounder faces than other members of the family, giving these animals an almost ape-like appearance. Another Miocene European genus, Anisodon, was more modestly sized, standing up to 1.5 meters or roughly 5 feet tall, and inhabited the humid subtropical forests of what is now Germany, alongside great apes, proboscideans, and saber-toothed cats. The Miocene seems to have been the heyday of these animals, with their diversity going into decline during the drier and cooler Pliocene. Chalicotheres died out in Europe at the end of the Miocene, but persisted in the more heavily forested regions of China and Southeast Asia. Indeed, two genera lingered here into the Middle Pleistocene approximately 781,000 years ago, being the youngest known of all Chalicotheres. These were Hesperotherium and Nestoritherium respectively, being relatively similar in appearance. Both possessed short, blunt-snouted jaws and lived slow, sedentary lives in the humid forests of China, Myanmar, and India. It's a little mind-blowing to think that these incredibly odd ungulate.
It's also really interesting how big their range is, too, because it's talking about them sort of diversifying and, like, the last vestiges of them existing being primarily over in Asia. But the last video, they also mentioned that they're native in North America as well up until about 10 million years ago. So they died out in North America sooner, it sounded like. But, like, hearing that they're, like, diversifying everywhere from, like, Bulgaria to Myanmar, and then also apparently are in North America is interesting for a species that's like one like this recent, because it's not like a continental drift thing where it's like, oh, we were on both Africa and South America and then they separated and now we're on both, like you see with like boas, for example. But it I guess you do see that, I guess, a little bit more with mammals because they tend to move around a little bit more on their own. They tend to be more migratory and whatnot. But yeah, like a big herbivore like this, like I said, I guess I wouldn't necessarily associate it with being like, yeah, I'm going to migrate from Bulgaria to Montana. It's a long ways to go when the continents are roughly in the same places they are now.
Lived alongside familiar modern animals like tigers, orangutans, and giant pandas, as well as iconic extinct forms such as Gigantopithecus. Like most Chalicotheres, these two genera were probably largely solitary.
I should get Carl to do Gigantopithecus for one of these. We haven't done a primate yet.
The reasons for the extinction of Chalicotheres in Asia remains uncertain. It was probably due to climatic fluctuations that reduced suitable forested habitats, and perhaps also the arrival of Homo erectus in the region by about 800,000 years ago.
Classic.
Whatever the case, it's a shame that these gorilla...
So there's a lot of really big mammals that exist sort of in this general time period, like post-dinosaur-y sort of time. And a lot of them go extinct. One, because of climate change stuff, but the other big thing that happens to a lot of them is humans and pre-human ancestors start going all over the place. And the thing that like humans are like adapted for, the thing we're really, really good at, is hunting big mammals. It's what we do. It's what we're basically built to do, is be in groups and hunt down and throw spears and rocks and be very effective at killing very big mammals. And so there's a lot of assumption that like when you're talking about the extinction of things like mammoths and woolly rhinos and stuff like this, that a lot of it is probably just like, yep, humans came and started hunting them down, and presumably a lot of the human migration that happens is following the migration paths of these animals. Like, you know, we see, you know, all the way up until, you know, like colonizing in North America, where you saw like tribes out on the Great Plains just followed the bison around, and it's probably a pretty good assumption that humans, 4 or 5 million years ago, you're sort of immediately like post-chimpanzee divergence humans, where you're, potentially even down to like your Australopithecine, like I said, 4 or 5 million years ago, or potentially even starting to do the same type of stuff where they're following migratory paths for these large mammals. Up until much more recently, they're talking about Homo erectus arriving in Southeast Asia, and that's probably, I don't even necessarily want to speculate on that. That's probably within the last million years or so, maybe a little before that. But yeah, the arrival of humanoid things that are able to like use tools to hunt spells the doom for a lot of these big mammals. It seems like a factor that comes up often whenever you're reading up on this type of stuff is, oh yeah, and then humans came.
Horses
To this
died
day.
out so recently, as I'm sure they would have been fascinating to observe in life. Other major subfamily of Chalicotheres were the Schizotherians, which are noticeably different from their Chalicotherian cousins in a number of ways. Although both groups possessed clawed digits, Schizotherians also had claws on their hind feet as well. Their overall body plan was also significantly less derived, with their forelimbs and hind limbs being closer in length, while still also walking in digitigrade stance like other perissodactyls. In fact, with their elongated necks and browsing lifestyles, these animals were somewhat reminiscent of the modern okapi, and even had similar elongated flexible tongues. However, the strangest feature of this group was the development of fully retractable claws.
We haven't heard him talk about the tongues yet. This is the first mention of a stretchy tongue out of these guys, which is something you do see in these like browsing things. Like giraffes famously have like weird long tongues, and like I said, okapis have big long tongues. Just because it like helps as far as like, hey, I gotta like get this little branch, like I'm gonna need something that I'm gonna use to bring it down towards me. Yeah, it might as well be a tongue if I'm a giraffe. Like I'm not gonna reach up there with my hoof and drag it down. So yeah, you see that in a lot of these. But like I said, with the ones like over here, like you were painting, it sounded like they used the claws more for that same function. Whereas I think he's talking more the ones like I'm painting now, where they are more full-time quadrupedal, and so are probably more dependent on just the length of the neck and tongue to get to the food that they're trying to reach.
A feature more often associated with arboreal carnivorans, such as felids and the Malagasy fossa. This allowed Schizotherians to travel across their preferred savanna and forested environments without blunting their claws. With these Chalicotheres inhabiting a wide range that encompassed most of Eurasia, Africa, and North America, one of the best-known members of the subfamily, Moropus, is represented by complete skeletons, which is rare among Chalicotheres as a whole. Native to what is now the United States, fossil remains have been uncovered from early to middle Miocene age deposits dated to between 20 and 13 million years ago. Standing about 8 feet tall at the shoulder, this animal was comparable to a modern draft horse in terms of size, and was a browsing herbivore that inhabited open savanna woodlands, walking with an odd pigeon-toed stance, with its feet turning inward. Moropus would have been quite slow-moving, defending itself from predatory borophagine canids and amphicyonids by slashing with its sharp claws. Another large Schizotherian was the late Oligocene genus Borisiacia, which was present in the semi-arid woodlands of Kazakhstan, with somewhat okapi-like body proportions and strong hind limbs. This animal was capable of rearing up to reach high-growing vegetation in a manner
I can tell this
comparable
guy
to
is
modern
like
goats.
kind of a nerd because he's just like assuming that everyone knows what an okapi is.
Borisiacia was also the most massive of all known Chalicotheres.
Closest relative to
Meanwhile,
giraffes
the
that
middle
currently
Miocene
exist.
North American
But
genus Tylocephalonyx possessed a thick domed skull, much like distantly related Calamansia.
he knows who's watching.
Though it is uncertain if this feature was used in headbutting or was more of a display structure. Schizotherians thrived during the Miocene.
And the videos we've been watching have brought up the sort of head bump on the one that I'm painting here. And they keep referring to it as like a headbutting and potentially display thing. And one thing I want to note on that quick is when you're talking about like headbutting, you're probably talking about competition within their own species. Doing things like ramming with your head is not usually a great way to actually protect yourself from predators. Like in animals that have that, it tends not to get used that way. Like you don't see like deer using their antlers like against predators really. It's a thing that you have, again, to compete with members of your own species, typically for mating purposes. And so that's why you're seeing a lot of speculation that it's maybe also like just a display piece as well. It's part of the reason I'm making here this bright pink lump on top of its head. I'm going to call that sort of a combined display piece and is it potentially head-butting competitive thing here.
Successfully spreading into Africa and North America from their Eurasian heartland. One of the more
what color
widespread
should I make
members
its
of the group was
eyes?
Chalicotheres, which was found across Africa and Eurasia from the late Miocene to the early Pleistocene, standing roughly 2 meters
Eyes
or
are
6
gonna
feet
be
6 inches tall and weighing up to 1,000 pounds.
Pink.
It possessed a rather goat-like build and was
But a
adapted
different
for
pink
browsing
than
in
its hump.
savanna ecosystems. Famously depicted walking with beasts, this was the youngest known Schizotherian and dwelt alongside early representatives of the genus Homo in eastern and southern Africa. It would appear that the transition to the Pleistocene was very tough on Chalicotheres as a whole, with more open grassland replacing the forest on which these animals relied. This also mirrors a decline in giraffoid diversity that occurred at around this time as well, suggesting that these specialized browsers struggled in these shifting conditions. Sadly, these very unique ungulates would finally perish by about 780,000 years ago, with the last forms being the highly specialized short-based Hesperotherium and Nestoritherium. No modern animals can effectively be compared to Chalicotheres, with elements of their unusual anatomy distantly reflected in giant pandas, gorillas, and the recently extinct ground sloths. In the end, Chalicotheres were truly a testament to the malleability of evolution. Thanks for watching, everyone. The next episode will be covering the Borophagians, the extinct bone-crushing canids of North America.
Hey, we
See
mentioned
you
them
again
earlier.
soon. Cheerio.
Bone-crushing dogs. Basically got out-competed by cats. Yeah, kind of a weird thing that happens during like continental drift and like I said, the Ice Age. You see it a bunch where you see species moving from one environment to another. And like I said, one of the things that happens is cats initially have their main diversification happens over in mainly Asia. So in Africa and Asia, most of the carnivores that you see are related to cats. And so you think about, lions and tigers and leopards and even like hyenas are actually, they kind of look like dogs, but they're actually more closely related to cats. Mongoose are basically cats. Fusas that he mentioned in there are, I'm pretty sure, felids as well. Or at least feliforms, whatever. But in North America, or in the collective Americas, we got dogs, basically, that filled that same niche. And they existed pretty much independently of each other for a lot of their history. But then all of a sudden, like I said, the Ice Age happens, you get your land bridge between Asia and North America, and you start seeing species cross between, and so you end up with, now all of a sudden you're seeing like the more successful types of like pack hunting dogs like wolves make their way over into Europe and Asia and are able to get a foothold there. Whereas, like I said, over in the Americas, we get these like kind of solo single hunting cats, basically, where this is, where mountain lions and jaguars and stuff like that, and, extinct now, but saber-toothed cats come over as well. Saber-tooths aren't solo hunting typically, but, and so, yeah, you, like, saw this sort of crossover that happened where you used to see a lot more, like, different types of cats that would do things like pack hunting. It used to be more of a thing, but dogs more or less do it better, so like the pack hunting predators mostly are dog related things now. And similarly, you used to see more kind of solo operating dogs than what exists now, but a lot of them get out competed by cats, especially like the bigger ones don't really exist anymore because cats just do it better. So you saw sort of a relative like loss of diversification happen in both of those groups when the mixing happened, because the big solo hunters, like I said, basically the cats won, so the dogs all went away, and then the pack hunters, the bigger pack hunters at least, the dogs mostly won, so most of the cats go away. We still have like lions left, but So yeah, a interesting like, do you call that an invasive species? I don't know. Like, at what point does an animal quit becoming an invasive species? It's an interesting question to ask, even in the context of like human caused invasive species. We tend not to think of animals that like get introduced into an environment more than a couple decades ago. We tend to not think of them as invasives. Kind of a weird thing. Like, for example, even here at the Science Center, one of the things we have here and participate in is a program called Trout in the Schools, where we raise rainbow trout and then release them into the wild here. It's endorsed by the DNR and Trout Unlimited. It's a partnership thing we've got. Rainbow trout are not native to Minnesota. Like, they aren't native anywhere east of the Rocky Mountains, but they've been stocked in all these lakes for the last 150 years or so. And so, like I said, we tend not to think of them as being an invasive because we did it on purpose, and they've been here long enough that nobody really remembers the time before they before they were here. But then you flip that, and something that just got introduced in the last 20, 30 years, something like, I don't know, rusty crayfish, for example. We do think of that as an invasive because it's more recent. Is it any more detrimental to the environment? Probably not in any meaningful way, but because it's more recent, we tend to think of it as worse for whatever reason. Another fun one, lampreys in Lake Superior. I think it's sea lampreys in Lake Superior. Are there because of canals that have gotten dug. So it's not a situation where it's like, you talk about like rusty crayfish, or you talk about like zebra mussels, and they come as hitchhikers on boats mostly, is how they move around, and that's how they become invasives. But for things like the sea lampreys, this isn't really the thing. Basically, I said they traversed through human-produced waterways, so they got there under their own power, and as a result, it's sort of ends up being sort of a weird thing where, like, do we still call this an invasive? Like, it's human action that caused them to be here, but it's not like direct, I guess, human action. It's just like humans created an opportunity for them to get to this new place. Weird thing, invasive species. And like I said, does any type of like new species coming from somewhere else constitute being called an invasive? Like we were, just talking about with all the stuff that moved between Asia and North America during the Ice Age over your Bering Strait land bridge. Are horses? Ooh, here's another fun one. Are horses invasive in the Americas? Horses were native in the Americas back in the Ice Age, but they went extinct. But then when European colonists arrive, horses end up escaping from these European colonies, and now we have a population of wild horses again in the Americas that we, like I said, had otherwise gone extinct. So there are species or a group of species that mostly diversified in the Americas, as if I remember right, and then moved over to Europe and Asia and were like domesticated by people over there. Meanwhile, they went extinct in the Americas, and then when those people came back to the Americas, they brought horses back with them and reintroduced them as a wild population here. Do you call that an invasive species? I don't know. Thoughts, feelings? That's maybe you can hear O'Reilly, the red-tailed hawk, making noise. He has kind of a weird raspy call to him because he's here because he got injured. He got a electrical burn, ran into a power line and got burned by it when he was a very young hawk, and it seems to have somehow affected his ability to vocalize as well, because he doesn't make your typical hawk noise. He has all these like, it's a kind of goofy, raspy calls that he does. He also has one that sounds like a little chick kind of peeping. Just a little high-pitched little peep that he does. It always like spooks the guests because we feed them quail primarily. Each of our rescue raptors gets about a third of a quail every day while they're here. But people will see him like eating on something that like is feathery as, a bird, and hear him like peeping while he's doing it and be like, oh my gosh, are they feeding him like a live chick? Is he eating a chick alive in there? And it's like, no, it's just the noise he makes because he has weird, bad vocal cords, seemingly. Not his fault. Yeah, it's interesting. Just like large mammals in general, we don't see stuff of like the scale that these Chalicotheres seemingly were in nearly as much diversity as we used to. We think of like rhinos and hippos, and we think of them as like, yeah, these are like some of the biggest animals in the world. They're exceptional. But like I said, you go back just a few million years, and there was a lot more stuff that was that size. You hear the term megafauna, meaning big animals, basically. And particularly, like I said, there was a lot of mammalian megafauna that existed for a long time. And like I said, we've talked about sort of extinction forces a couple times already, but I said a lot of it is the movement of humans around the world being very good at hunting them, and a lot of it is just like climate changey type of stuff. At a certain point, you get like sort of a reduction of the benefits. You get sort of a diminishing returns that happens on features, where like you need to be big because being big helps you avoid predators that would otherwise potentially be interested in eating you. But like when those predators start to go away, all of a sudden like all being big gets you is like a greater need to consume more food. Basically, it takes more energy to operate a bigger body. And so one of the things that they talked about in the first video was how potentially something that would have happened is that these like four-chambered stomach, ruminant hoofed animals potentially would have just been able to, operate in a pretty similar niche and be smaller and operate more efficiently. And in the absence of something like, like saber-toothed cats that are like a genuine threat to an animal, this big, there's no real benefit to being that big. And so, like I said, all you end up with is, I need more food, I'm less efficient with my food, I'm just going to lose to a deer. Kind of the problem that a lot of those big mammals ended up facing. I think I need one more color. Maybe I'll just use this green that I already started. I poured this green, kind of intending to mix it in with stuff, and then just ended up not really using it. But yeah, we'll give some green splotchies on mine. Why not? I got a splotchy, colorful fellow over here. One of the things that's interesting that they didn't really talk about is they talked about the sort of hump on the head for sort of the one I'm working on here. They didn't make any mention of if there was like a sexual dimorphism element of that, where is it a thing that they only see in the males, is it something they only see in the females? Because when you're talking about it as like a display thing, in mammals typically that's going to be something that you're seeing in males specifically is like, display coloration and things like that, because usually the females are the ones being picky about who they're mating with in mammals, and so the males are the ones who are competing for attention, so they do all sorts of weird stuff to, get the attention of the females. And so I'm being very, like, loud and weird with mine as far as my coloration, because like, yeah, why not? Who's to say what the fur of these guys looked like, and who's to say if a lady Chalicothere wouldn't be like, ooh, look at those blue bands on you. That means you're healthy. Or, you know, if the females had, you know, the big lump on the head, like I said, if they're using it for like headbutting and, you know, interspecies competition like that, you know, if it is like a mating competition thing, you probably wouldn't see it in the females, like you don't see antlers on deer, for example. But I didn't see hear any mention of that, so I wonder if it's something that's like still speculated upon, or if it's something that, you know, just didn't come up in either of the videos we watched. But I think I'm going to call this a finished Chalicothere, and I'll bring him up a little closer to the camera so you can kind of see. You look like you've got some fun coloration on your Carnotaur there as well. So like I said, the Carnotaur was the one last week, and if you are interested in a Carnotaur and missed out on it last month, I said last week, I meant last month, December, we always do a sort of yearly recap one where we, you know, whatever ones didn't get used during the month, we do sort of a grab bag where you can come back and sort of pick any of the things that we did throughout the year. And so, let's bring these up close to camera here, show off our beautiful art that we've made to our one viewer that we've got here, but usually a bigger audience for the VOD on YouTube.
Just one.
There you go. And so you can see I did sort of the bright pink on the forehead. Like I said, we sort of talked about it as a display thing. So when I think in pinkish, like I said, it's blood flow. That's just how the way a lot of display coloration works, is you're basically making the thing flush with blood. So the pink I thought made sense. And then I noticed a lot of the ones they had there had white stripes or bands on them, so I did a little white incorporated, and then got a little more fun with my banding. And what do you got? What's your rationale here?
There isn't one. It's just bright colors.
Hey, that's perfectly valid as well. And that's one of the things we always love to encourage. If you do come and do one of these painting nights, it doesn't have to look like anything in particular. You don't need a reason that's any better than I like these colors and I think it might look neat. Like I said, part of the appeal of this, and part of the appeal of the whole deal is, hey, even the people who are working really hard and trying to make it look good and make it look like it's like, ooh, it's like a real Chalicothere type of thing, they're probably just as wrong as you are. Like I said, part of the fun of this. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. I'm going to sign off here. Thank you for your help. And shout outs to PBS